Laura thought that this Saturday would be like any other rare moment of peace in her routine. The neighborhood seemed wrapped in an almost magical tranquility, with the sound of her children's laughter echoing as they explored the world around them together. For her, the simple act of walking alongside Jake and Ben, absorbing the soft breeze and the fresh morning scent, was a welcome relief from the intensity of her life as a judge. However, that calm was a fragile mask about to break. The stark contrast between Laura and her children did not go unnoticed by the strangers who crossed their path. Small, lingering glances and casual murmurs had almost become routine, but Laura knew that sooner or later prejudice could emerge from the shadows and manifest itself directly. That sunny morning, an unexpected encounter was about to test not only her patience, but also her strength and resilience. What began as an innocent walk in search of precious moments with her family was about to transform into an episode no one could have foreseen. How far would the assumptions of others go? And how would Laura respond when her values, dignity, and humanity were so directly challenged? Let this immersive story guide you through events that go beyond the obvious, revealing the deep layers of courage and determination of a woman living in a world that insists on testing her at every step. Not a subscriber yet? Join our community by clicking subscribe and activate the bell to receive a notification every time a new video is posted. Jake ran with his usual energy, his laughter echoing through the streets as he chased the swift movement of a bird which seemed to play with him, hopping from branch to branch. "Look here, Mom!" he exclaimed enthusiastically, bending down to observe something on the ground, probably a childhood treasure, like a fallen feather or a leaf with an unusual shape. Behind him, Ben maintained his serene form, but with a subtle smile that lit up his face. He held Laura's hand firmly, as if wanting to make sure nothing in the world could pull him away from this moment with his mother. The neighborhood was immersed in almost perfect silence, interrupted only by the occasional bird song and the soft sound of the wind caressing the trees. Around them, the houses were lined up with impeccable precision. Each one seemed to compete for perfection. Meticulously trimmed lawns, vibrant flowers decorating the gardens, and white fences gleaming under the sunlight. It was a scene that exuded security and tranquility, the kind of place where the outside world seemed like nothing more than a distant whisper. Laura took a deep breath, feeling the fresh, morning scent mixed with the faint perfume of the flowers gently swaying in the breeze. In that moment, she felt a silent gratitude for being there, for having that rare pause from the hectic routine, for seeing her children happy in an environment where they seemed free from any worries. But deep down, there was always a slight oppression, a persistent awareness that for her, that peace was often temporary, an interval between the challenges that life inevitably presented. The tranquility of the moment was interrupted as if a veil of security had been abruptly torn. As they turned the corner, Laura caught the sound of a soft, steady engine, but what really caught her attention was the deliberate pace with which the patrol car approached. Her steps faltered for a second, but she pressed on, determined not to show nervousness. Just a regular patrol car, she tried to convince herself. But the focused gaze, following the car's movement and the slight pressure in her stomach, said otherwise. When the vehicle slowed down and stopped across the street, directly aligned with her and her children, the tension escalated. The sunny day seemed to have lost some of its lightness. The doors of the patrol car opened with a metallic click, and two men stepped out. The older one was an imposing figure. His broad shoulders and stern expression contrasted with the soft morning light. He didn't say anything, but his eyes seemed to weigh every detail in front of him with a disconcerting coldness. The second officer, younger, seemed out of place. His body language betrayed uncertainty. The uneasy look that shifted between Laura and the children did not go unnoticed, but it did not lessen the pressure she felt in the air. Laura instinctively adjusted her posture, lifting her head with confidence as she tightened her grip on Ben's hand, who stayed close by her side. Jake, still ahead, stopped when he noticed the uniformed men and took a step back, looking at his mother with a mix of curiosity and confusion. As the two officers walked towards them, the sound of their boots crushing the gravel seemed to echo, each step heavier than the last. Laura knew what was coming next. She had felt that sensation before, a mix of discomfort and anticipation pressing against her chest. It was the same type of situation she, as a judge, tried to fight in her legal decisions, the hasty judgment, the suspicion cast without basis. But now, in this moment, she wasn't a professional protected by the walls of a courtroom. She was just a woman, a mother with her children, standing under the watchful gaze of two men who seemed determined to find something, anything, that could justify their approach. The tension in the air seemed to grow with every second. Laura knew that this moment was crucial, and any reaction could define the course of the situation. Her instinct, trained both by her experience as a judge and by years of facing similar situations, told her she had to keep control, even if inside she felt the indignation rising. She took a deep breath, counting mentally to 3 before responding. "Where did you get them from?" Laura asked, her tone firm but not raised, maintaining her self-control. Her gaze rested directly on the younger officer, who briefly diverted his eyes, as if recognizing the weight of his own question. "They are my children. I gave birth to them, I raised them, and I love them just like any mother would. Help our channel grow. Leave a like, subscribe, and activate the bell to stay updated on upcoming content. And we want to know, where are you watching from? Comment below." The silence that followed was thick, laden with a mixture of discomfort and challenge. The older officer frowned, his eyes still studying the children's faces and comparing them to Laura's. He stepped forward, his hands resting on his utility belt in a posture that suggested absolute authority. "Can I see your identification, please?" he said, his voice firm, almost sharp, as if the mere request carried an implicit accusation. Laura nodded slowly, carefully pulling out her wallet. She knew that sudden movements could be misinterpreted, and the last thing she wanted was for this to escalate unnecessarily. As she took out the documents, she felt Ben's gaze, still holding tightly onto her hand, now squeezing it with more force. Jake, standing beside her, watched the scene with wide eyes, absorbing the moment without fully understanding, but clearly uncomfortable. "Here it is," Laura said, handing the papers to the older officer. "My name is Laura Mendez. I'm a judge at the State Court of Justice. These are my children, Jake and Ben. Is there any specific reason for this intervention?" There was a note of firmness in her voice now, still under control, but making it clear that she was not intimidated. As the older officer examined the documents, the younger one nervously shuffled his feet, as if wanting to step away from the scene. The silence returned, interrupted only by the whisper of the trees in the wind and the occasional sound of a car in the distance. Laura knew she had to stay strong, but she couldn't help thinking about what this situation was teaching her children, a lesson she never wanted them to learn so soon. The police officer's comment hung in the air, laden with more than just protocol. Laura kept her gaze fixed on the senior officer, her body rigid as she processed his words. Suspicious activities. She had heard that excuse before, so many times it almost seemed rehearsed. Her stomach tightened, but her exterior remained calm, calculated. "Suspicious activities?" Laura repeated, her voice firm but without aggression. "I'm walking with my children, as any mother would on a Saturday morning. I'd like to know what kind of activity that represents for you." The younger officer seemed more and more uncomfortable, the weight of the situation visible on his face. He shot a quick glance at his senior partner, as if seeking guidance or approval. The senior officer, however, remained impassive, his eyes fixed on Laura with the same intensity as before. "Ma'am, we don't want to cause trouble," the younger one began hesitantly, but was interrupted by his partner. "Just do what we asked and we can all move on," the senior officer said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. Laura took a deep breath, maintaining her calm with great effort. It wasn't just about her at that moment. It was about the two innocent faces looking at her, seeking comfort and answers. They couldn't see her anger, nor perceive the subtle fear she kept under control. That was a lesson Laura had hoped never to have to teach so soon, but that reality imposed in that instant. "Okay," she replied, slowly taking out her wallet. She handed her identification to the senior officer, making sure her movements were careful and deliberate. "My name is Laura Mendez. I'm a judge, as you can see here. This is my home, this is my neighborhood, Everything seems to be in order," the officer finally said, handing back the identification. But the tone of his voice, dry and emotionless, offered no relief. "Thank you," Laura replied, putting her documents away. "I hope you have a good day." Without waiting for a response, she took Jake's hand and began walking, keeping Ben close. Even as they moved away, she could feel the officer's gazes burning into her back. The peace of that morning was irrevocably broken, but Laura knew she had to keep going, for the children and for herself. Even in that moment of apparent closure, indignation bubbled just beneath the surface. She knew this wouldn't be the last time. Click subscribe and activate notifications. Only then will you stay updated on our upcoming videos and won't miss anything. Laura felt the impact of the words like a blow, even though she had expected them. Every fiber of her being wanted to protest, to confront the explicit injustice, but she knew it wasn't the time. Not in front of her children, not in front of armed men who had already judged her before hearing her story. With controlled movement, she responded firmly, "Okay, I'll show my identification. But I need you to explain to me why you're stopping me." Her voice was firm, but not hostile, a tone honed by the experience of navigating delicate situations, both inside and outside the courtroom. She searched her purse with slow, deliberate movements, all while keeping her gaze fixed on the two officers. Laura knew she couldn't allow the situation to be misinterpreted. Jake's attentive gaze and Ben's tense breathing were a constant reminder that her response wasn't just for her, but for both of them. As she handed the document to the senior officer, she felt Ben's small body press even closer to her leg, seeking security. Jake, now silent, seemed to absorb every detail of the interaction, which broke Laura's heart even more. He was so young, yet already exposed to something she had hoped to avoid. The officer took the identification with firm hands and began to examine it. The silence that followed was sharp, heavy. The younger officer seemed to want to say something but remained silent, clearly uncomfortable with the intervention. Laura kept her posture straight, even as a wave of indignation grew inside her. "Laura Mendez. Judge, huh?" The senior officer finally spoke, with a tone that bordered on sarcasm. He handed the document back without a smile, without an apology. "Sorry for the inconvenience. We're just doing our duty." Laura took her identification back, her eyes still fixed on the man in front of her. "I understand you have a job to do," she said, carefully choosing her words. "But I hope you reflect on what you truly consider suspicious activity. I'm not the one who caused this situation." The officer hesitated for a moment, as if considering whether to respond, but stepped back instead. Without another word, the two returned to the patrol car. The sound of the doors closing was followed by the hum of the engine, and the car began to pull away, but not before casting one last lingering look at Laura and her children. When the car disappeared around the corner, Laura knelt down, bringing Ben closer, while Jake finally broke the silence. "Mom, what was that? Why were they asking about us?" Laura swallowed, searching her mind for the right words to explain the inexplicable. She knew that this moment would stay with them forever, shaping the way they saw the world. "It's complicated, son," she said softly, running her hand through Jake's hair. "Some people judge others for no reason, but the important thing is that we're together, and nothing is going to change that." Even as she tried to comfort them, Laura knew that this wasn't a one-time conversation. It was just the beginning of a long road of explanations, a road she wished her children would never have to walk. The justification hung in the air like a veiled accusation. Laura knew what it really meant. Her presence was the suspicious activity. She wanted to scream, challenge the hypocrisy, but she knew she couldn't, not with her children there. The fear in Ben's eyes and the confusion on Jake's face were painful reminders that, more than ever, she needed to be strategic. She took a deep breath, allowing the rage bubbling inside her to be tamed by the need to protect her children. Kneeling a bit, she got closer to Ben and softly murmured, "Everything will be fine, darling. Just stay close to me." Standing up, she held the senior officer's gaze with a mixture of firmness and resignation. She knew he expected submission, but she wouldn't give it. There was calm, but also resistance. "I'm willing to cooperate, but you need to understand the impact of this," she said, her voice steady. "My children are scared. Do you really think a mother walking with her children represents a threat?" The younger officer looked confused. He glanced at Laura, then at the children, and took an almost imperceptible step back. It was as if he understood, though late, that this intervention was unnecessary. But the senior officer, unyielding, remained impassive. "We're just doing our job, ma'am. Show us your identification and we'll all move on with our day." Laura had no illusions that this was about duty. She knew it was about power, about control, about the need to reaffirm prejudices, but she couldn't turn this moment into a battleground, not with her children at her side. She slowly and deliberately took out her wallet and extended the document. "Here it is," she said, handing it over firmly. "Laura Mendez, Judge. And yes, I'm aware of my rights." The senior officer took the document and examined it with exaggerated care, as if searching for a reason to prolong the interaction. Meanwhile, the younger officer stared at the ground, clearly uncomfortable. Ben was holding on to Laura's leg tightly, and Jake, though farther away, had a furrowed brow, processing something he still didn't fully understand, but knew wasn't right. After a long moment, the senior officer handed the wallet back with a neutral expression. "Everything's in order," he declared, as if doing a favor. Laura put the wallet away without averting her gaze from him. Her tone, when responding, was firm and direct. "I hope this serves as a lesson for you as well." The younger officer seemed about to say something, but the senior officer gestured for him to leave. As the patrol car drove away, Laura stood there, motionless for a moment, trying to compose herself. Finally, she knelt in front of Ben and Jake, holding both their hands. "I know this was strange," she began, carefully choosing her words. "But the important thing is that you know, no matter what others think, we will always be together. Do you understand?" Jake nodded slowly, still with a confused expression, while Ben simply threw himself into Laura's arms, hugging her tightly. She held them, feeling the weight of that moment, aware that although she wanted to protect them from everything, she couldn't always prevent the challenges the world would place in their path. She stood up again, holding their hands even tighter than before, and continued the walk. The sun was shining, the trees swaying gently in the wind, but for Laura, that morning would never be the same. Jake's words echoed in the tense silence of the street, like a truth no one wanted to admit. Laura felt the weight of her eldest son's question like a knife, cutting through the discomfort and injustice. There was no way to avoid that moment, nor to hide what was happening. She knew she would have to face it, not just for the officers in front of her, but for the two pairs of eyes looking at her for answers. She took a deep breath, trying to control the emotion threatening to spill over. In a calm but firm tone, she turned to Jake. "You're right, son. I didn't do anything wrong, but sometimes some people make wrong conclusions about us without knowing us, and that's why we have to be strong and patient." The senior officer looked at Jake, raising an eyebrow but said nothing. The younger officer seemed even more uncomfortable, now glancing down at the ground. The weight of the situation was starting to sink in for him, though his presence still reinforced the tension of the moment. Ben, with tears still running down his face, squeezed Laura's hand harder. "But why?" he asked, his voice broken with sobs. "We're just walking." "Why don't they believe us?" Laura's heart broke at that question. There, in front of her children, she realized she couldn't protect them completely from reality. They were seeing, for the first time, what it meant to live in a world where the color of your skin could be interpreted as a threat. She needed to find a way to answer, something that would comfort them, but also be the truth. Kneeling next to Ben, she placed her hands on his shoulders, looking into his tear-filled eyes, and then at Jake's. "Some people are afraid of what they don't understand," she said, her voice soft but firm. "And sometimes they judge before they know. That's not fair, and it never will be. But we know who we are, and we know we're not doing anything wrong. And that's what matters." Laura stood up, now looking directly at the officers, her posture reflecting her determination. Her tone wasn't defiant, but it was one of unwavering firmness. "I believe I've already answered your questions. If there's nothing else, I'll continue my walk with my children." The senior officer hesitated, visibly annoyed by Laura's resolute attitude. But with no more arguments or justifications, he finally stepped back and signaled to the younger officer. "Everything's in order here. Let's go," he said, emotionless, before turning and walking back to the patrol car. Laura watched as the two men walked away, the sound of the car doors closing being the only thing that broke the silence. When the car finally left, she exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She looked at her children, who still seemed confused and shaken but were safe. "See," she said, trying to sound calm. "I told you we'd be fine. Let's go home, okay?" Jake and Ben nodded, but Laura knew this moment wouldn't be easy to forget, not for them and not for her. As she held their hands and continued walking, she promised herself that she would do everything in her power to turn this experience into something that would strengthen them. Even though the world was unfair, they would know how to face whatever came their way together. The situation was on the verge of exploding. Laura could feel her heart beating rapidly, but she couldn't let it show. She knew that any wrong move or word could be interpreted as hostility, and that was not an option, not with her children there. Still, the senior officer's fixed gaze and the implied threat in his stance made it clear that he was willing to go to the very last consequence. Jake, with his little defender's stance, was staring directly at the officers, challenging them in a way Laura had never seen before. His bravery moved her and broke her heart at the same time. He was just a child, but he was already facing a world that seemed cruel and unjust. "Jake, come here, please," Laura said in a controlled but firm voice. He hesitated for a moment, then backed away, returning to her side. Ben was sobbing louder now, and Laura ran a comforting hand through his hair while her own thoughts desperately searched for a solution. She looked at the senior officer, keeping a calm but authoritative tone. "I'll show my ID, but I want to make it clear that I'm doing this under duress, not because I've done anything wrong, but because I think about the well-being of my children. This is for them," she said, emphasizing every word carefully. With slow and deliberate movements, Laura took out her wallet and showed the document, keeping her eyes fixed on the officer. She knew she had to project control, even if she felt the overwhelming weight of the situation. The senior officer took the ID without thanks or apologies, examining it as if looking for a mistake. He seemed to feed off the tension, while the younger officer remained restless, clearly torn between following orders and the uncomfortable awareness that this wasn't right. "Laura Mendes, Judge," the senior officer said, his tone heavy with cynicism. He looked back at Laura, now with a small smile at the corner of his lips. Interesting. Laura held his gaze firmly, not blinking. If you're done, I'd like to continue my walk with my children, she responded, her voice sharp but not raising in tone. The younger officer finally spoke, in a low voice, almost a whisper. I think everything's fine, sir. We don't need to prolong this. The senior officer shot a stern look at his partner, but after a moment of tension, he handed the document back to Laura. All right, he said dryly, as if doing her a favor. You can go. Laura took the ID and put it back in her purse calmly. She turned to Jake and Ben, placing her hands on their shoulders. Let's go, she told them, starting to walk slowly, without looking back. The children followed her, Ben still holding her hand tightly, and Jake, now quieter, stared at the ground, clearly processing everything that had happened. Laura felt the officers' gazes burning into her back until the sound of the patrol car, driving away, echoed down the street. As they turned the corner and were out of sight, Laura stopped. She knelt and hugged both her children tightly, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. I'm so proud of you, she said, her voice trembling. You were so brave. Jake finally broke the silence. Mom, this should never have happened. Laura swallowed hard, searching for the right words. You're right, son. It never should have happened. But what matters is that we're together, and we'll never let anyone separate us. She stood up, holding their hands firmly. Let's go home. As they walked, Laura felt the weight of the day. But she also knew that despite the pain, she had planted something important in her children's hearts. The certainty that they could always count on her, even in the hardest moments. Laura held the hug tightly with her children, feeling how deeply that moment was etched into her mind. The fight was not over. In fact, that was just one of the battles she knew she would have to face. But in that instant, her priority was protecting what truly mattered, Jake and Ben. She stood up, holding each of their hands firmly. Let's go home, guys. Her voice was soft, but there was a note of determination that couldn't be ignored. The walk back was silent, their footsteps echoing on the quiet sidewalk. The superficial peace of the neighborhood seemed like a cruel irony, as if nothing had happened. But for Laura and her children, everything was different now. When they arrived home, Laura asked the children to sit on the couch. Ben was calmer now, but still clung to her hand, as if afraid she might disappear. Jake, on the other hand, seemed more thoughtful, the anger he had shown replaced now by a serious curiosity. I want you to know, Laura began, kneeling in front of them, that none of what happened today was our fault. We didn't do anything wrong. What you saw was an example of what happens when people let prejudice decide how they treat others. Jake leaned forward slightly, frowning. Does this happen to you all the time, Mom? He asked, his voice filled with a mix of concern and indignation. Laura took a deep breath before answering. Not all the time, but more times than I'd like. She looked directly at him, wanting him to feel the sincerity in her words. That's why I fight, not just as a judge, but as a mother, as a citizen. I fight so that you grow up in a world where this is no longer acceptable. Ben finally spoke, in a low and hesitant voice. I was scared. I thought they were going to take you away. Laura's heart tightened. She drew him to her, gently stroking his hair. You were so brave, Ben, and I promise you that I'll never let anything like this separate us. We're a family, and nothing can change that. Jake crossed his arms, his expression determined. Are you going to report them, right? So they learn that they can't do this to people. Laura nodded. Yes, Jake, I'm going to file a report and make sure they're held accountable. What happened today can't be forgotten. She knew the road ahead would be long, but she also knew that she had to show her children that fighting against injustices wasn't just an option, it was an obligation. That episode, though painful, would be transformed into a lesson of resilience and empowerment. And you know what? she added, trying to bring a bit of lightness to the moment. "I'm so proud of you both. Today you showed me how strong you are." Jake smiled slightly while Ben cuddled into Laura's lap, finally relaxing. Laura knew this wouldn't be the last time she faced situations like this, but she was certain that together her family was stronger. And at that moment, that was all that mattered. In the stillness of the night, Laura continued writing, adjusting every detail of the report to ensure the truth would be heard. She knew her role as a judge not only gave her a powerful voice, but also the responsibility to use it for those who didn't have the same opportunity. It wasn't just about her personal experience, but the possibility of opening a door to change. Meanwhile, in a poorly lit office at the police station, the senior officer flipped through papers absent-mindedly. His normally confident, rigid posture seemed a little heavier. Every page he turned brought with it the echo of the woman's words on the street. "You're making a serious mistake." No matter how hard he tried to justify his actions, that phrase wouldn't leave him. He knew his position was at risk, but beyond that, he was beginning to realize that there was something fundamentally wrong with what he had done. The younger officer, sitting at another desk, couldn't focus. His mind replayed the frightened looks of the children and Laura's calm but firm words. He felt an unbearable weight on his chest. That wasn't why he had decided to join the police force. He wanted to protect, not intimidate. In that moment, he couldn't decide what was harder, facing his mistake or admitting that he was part of something bigger and unjust. Days passed, but Laura's complaint quickly gained attention. Her position as a civil rights judge lent legitimacy to the case, and the media began to investigate. Journalists didn't just report the incident, but also uncovered other similar cases in testimonies from other victims. Laura knew her report had become a spark in a necessary debate. At home, she continued with her most important role, being a mother. Conversations with Jake and Ben were frequent, and she worked hard to help them understand what had happened without destroying their innocence. One Saturday, while preparing breakfast, Jake watched her attentively, still trying to comprehend what he had witnessed. "Mum, what's going to happen to them now?" he asked, his serious tone seeming beyond his years. Laura placed the coffee cup on the table and sat next to him. "They're being investigated, and if it's proven they acted wrong, they'll have to face the consequences," she explained patiently. "That's what we call responsibility." Jake thought for a moment before responding. "And will they learn from this?" Laura smiled slightly, but her expression remained serious. "I hope so. That's the goal. It's not just about punishing Jake. It's about making sure people understand the impact of their actions so they don't make the same mistakes again." As the days turned into weeks, the impact of the case grew. The police officers were temporarily suspended, and the debate about racism and abuse of power gained momentum. Local media organized debates, invited experts to speak, and people began to share their own experiences. Laura's case had become a catalyst for something bigger. At the police station, the consequences were inevitable. The senior officer faced critical looks from colleagues and superiors. The confidence he once had in his impunity began to crumble as he understood the extent of Laura's actions. He knew he needed to reflect on his choices, but the idea of admitting mistakes felt unbearable. On the other hand, the younger officer was on the verge of change. He began to discreetly participate in community meetings to better understand the experiences of people who had faced prejudice. He wanted to listen, learn, and perhaps find a way to repair some of the damage he had helped cause. For Laura, the process was still ongoing, but she knew that every small victory was a step in the right direction. Even amidst the emotional exhaustion, she felt that the impact was spreading, touching not just her life, but also the lives of many others. That night, as she looked at her children sleeping in peace, she promised herself she would keep fighting. not for vengeance, but for justice, for them and for the world they would one day inherit. Laura's story became a symbol of resilience and determination. She knew that despite the victories she was achieving, the fight against prejudice and injustice was ongoing. But what motivated her was the certainty that every step toward change made a difference, not just for her, but for society as a whole. The following month, the city announced the creation of a new independent oversight policy to investigate police abuse complaints. This move was widely credited to Laura's courage in facing the system, even in the face of adversity. Community organizations began using her case as an example in debates about structural racism and the importance of holding institutions accountable. For Laura, seeing these changes take place was a source of comfort, but the most significant impact was the one she saw in her own home. Jake and Ben were growing with a sense of justice and empathy she had never imagined they would develop so soon. Jake, now more mature, helped his brother understand complex situations, while Ben, even in his innocence, asked questions that showed his growing understanding of the world. One morning, while walking through the neighborhood again, Jake tugged at his mother's arm. "Mom, if I ever see something bad like you saw, can I do something?" he asked, his eyes shining with determination. Laura knelt down to his height, holding his face gently. "Yes, my love, whenever you see something bad, you can do something. You can speak up, you can help, you can show people what's right. That's how the world changes." Ben, overhearing the conversation, took his mother's hand. "And me too, Mom. Can I help?" Laura laughed softly, pulling both of them into a hug. "Of course you can, darling, we all can, and I'm so proud that you already want to." As the sun shone brightly in the sky that morning, Laura felt a wave of renewed hope. The fight was still far from over, but she was no longer alone. She was raising two strong and compassionate souls, ready to carry the torch of change. Looking at her children, Laura realized that despite all the challenges, the future was full of possibilities. And with them by her side, she knew that together they could continue to build a path toward a more just world. If this story inspired you, leave a like to support the channel and subscribe to see more content like this. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you won't miss the next chapters, and let me know where you're watching from. We love hearing from every corner of the world where our channel reaches.